Now, while our safety and security starts at home, in our communities and our borders, it also extends around the world. As I've said before from this floor, we now have the most dangerous geopolitical environment that we've had since World War II. Texans voted resoundingly for President Trump in this last election, in part because of his pledge to hold China accountable. China threatens the peace in the Indo-Pacific by threatening to invade its neighbor, Taiwan, and interrupt freedom of commerce and freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. One of the ways that we can hold China accountable is to pass my legislation to address outbound investment in China. I just had a chance to visit with the new Treasury Secretary nominee, and I told him it was really strange to me when you look at historically how we've dealt with the Soviet Union and how we've dealt with China, both of which are ruled by communist governments. Many years ago, at the beginning of the Cold War, George Kennan, a famous diplomat, wrote something called the Long Memorandum, where he said, "You are not going to change communist Russia. It's an ideological obsession they have. You're not going to change their minds, so what you need to do, what the free world needs to do, is to contain them." And that's what the Cold War was all about, leading ultimately to the fall of the Soviet Union. Strangely enough, the United States' position toward China was just the opposite. Under President Clinton, he invited them into the World Trade Organization, believing that somehow, by engaging in more trade with the rest of the world, that somehow China and the Communist Party would change. Well, as Deng Xiaoping, one of the former leaders of Communist China, said, "Hide your motives and bide your time." And that's exactly what China has done. China has now become the manufacturing center for the world. Now, when you're buying inexpensive consumer products, that's one thing. But when you consider the vulnerability of our supply chains and things that China makes and does, like processes critical minerals, which it does, 90% of the critical minerals in the world that we need for a variety of products, including military weapons, that represents a huge vulnerability. Well, we need to know who is investing in what industries in China, because right now, the rough estimate of the market value of American-based investment in China in 2020 was $2.3 trillion. Well, China has built its economy, which by itself should not be a big concern, but they've now become a rival to the United States. If they played by the rules, that would be one thing, but China is famous for not honoring intellectual property laws and stealing all the technology they can. And they are using their economic power, which is synonymous with their military power, because they have something called civilian military fusion laws, which said if the private sector creates a new innovative product, they have to share it with the People's Liberation Army and the Communist Party in China. So my point is, my outbound investment piece of legislation says we need to know who's investing money in China and what that is being used for. Now, I could care less if people want to build more Burger Kings or Starbucks in China. I'm not worried about that. But when you start talking about advanced semiconductors, when you start talking about serial intellectual property theft, when you look at some of the weapon systems and the airframes that China has been creating, they bear remarkable resemblance to those that we built here in the United States, because they've engaged in massive theft through cyber attacks and through intellectual property theft. But it's simply foolish for the United States to continue blindly, to continue to invest billions of dollars in the very defense systems and technologies that the Chinese Communist Party could use to our detriment in the Indo-Pacific. Our colleague, Senator Sullivan from Alaska, just retired as a colonel from the Marines, and he puts it very poignantly. He said, American investors are going to fund the very military buildup that will result in the death of my Marines if China were to invade Taiwan. To me, and I'm sure to all of us, that's simply unacceptable. But right now we are flying blind, and that needs to change. While some might be concerned about lost investment potential in China, there's plenty of opportunities here at home and in other parts around the world as we see more fringe shoring and near shoring to create dependable supply chains to Asia, India, and elsewhere.